Thanks. In fact, just while we're waiting for it to be loaded up, let me tell you, I'm going to report the results, thank you, of some research we did for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in 2008 and 2009. It's part of a programme that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have had running looking at public attitudes towards poverty and inequality. I think precisely because, as Kate flagged up, they've realised that, you know, in many ways the constraints policymakers face, decision makers face, is not policy knowledge. You know, we know what policies would tackle poverty, but it's building public consent to implement them that remains key. You can ask me specifically about the research afterwards. I'll just tell you it was some polling and focus groups. I can tell you about the specifics later, but I won't dwell on that. Let me go straight into some of the results. And I actually want to start by going in. We were exploring how people understood fairness in general in allocation, whether we're talking about pay, whether we're talking about welfare policy. And we started with some exercises. In particular, we wanted to look at the kinds of distributive principles people thought were fair in particular contexts. And here I mean things like allocating stuff by need, by desert, by entitlement, and so on and so forth. And what we found was pretty straightforward. Well, firstly, people are basically pluralists. They recognise the validity of allocating stuff in different ways, and they tend to trade them off against each other in any particular situation. But given that, then, a particular pattern emerges. There was, in our groups and polling, a kind of minority, perhaps around a quarter, of more egalitarian participants who would tend to judge what was fair primarily on the basis of who needed what. But most of our participants would judge fairness primarily on the basis of desert or something like desert, who deserved what. And what was interesting is these groups often agreed about stuff, but even when they did, the motivation was different. Let me give you a couple of examples. So there was a lot of anger out there about the super rich, those on very high salaries. But whereas for the egalitarians, the anger was because people didn't need this amount of money. For most people, it was that they didn't deserve it. Their performance in their job didn't reflect that amount of money. Similarly, while there were lots of support for a higher minimum wage out there, for the egalitarians it tended to be because it wasn't enough to meet basic needs. For most people it was because someone in a low-paid job was working quite hard and maybe they deserve a bit more. And that difference in motivation is quite important. We'll come back to that in a minute. A consequence, though, of what I've said is that there is a belief out there in fair inequality, if you want, that deserved inequalities are fair. I guess maybe one way of putting it is for some people equity and fair procedures nevertheless can result in inequalities of outcomes in some ways. So most people believe deserved inequalities are fair. And that's one reason why sometimes kind of quite abstract appeals for greater equality in society sometimes fall on deaf ears. You know, I personally subscribe to quite overarching egalitarian visions of society as an end in itself, but for most people that was kind of missing the point. Let me give you an example. People like me, traditional egalitarians, tended to like arguments like this. There's something fundamentally wrong about a society in which some people earn so much more than others. But arguments like that left most people in our focus groups cold. They preferred arguments like this. While differences in wages are necessary, those doing low-paid jobs are often carrying out important roles. The country couldn't function without them. They deserve to be paid more. So arguments grounded in properly rewarding people for their effort and contribution. And that's one reason why these abstract appeals for greater equality sometimes fall on deaf ears. And particularly think about campaigning. I know what I think, but a say it louder version of that isn't going to have resonance with a lot of people. It's trying to think about the different motivations and starting points that people are coming from. Now, no one's going to pretend we can build a kind of egalitarian society on the basis of who deserves what. But what was quite interesting to note was even within that quite limited frame, the huge support for a number of quite progressive reforms that would make our welfare state more generous, more egalitarian. Let me give you some examples. I've mentioned support for a higher minimum wage. Huge support out there for that. And I'm going to show you the party breakdowns here, really just to show you that there's not really much difference. When people believe that policies are fairly rewarding effort, there's huge support across the political spectrum. So not much difference there. More financial support for carers. Huge support. Not much difference. Tackling tax avoidance, so it's a slightly different issue, but for a lot of people, particularly when they think about the avoidance behaviour, it was related to an issue of behaving in the right way, desert, Again, huge support, not much difference. So even on the basis of who deserves what, there's just a lot of no-brainers that politicians could just do immediately. Now, I'm talking about how people view fairness in who gets what, and kind of, in terms of what Harry and Kate were saying, kind of intrinsic judgments about intrinsic fairness. Something I just want to mention quickly is that beyond those rational evaluations of fairness, people brought a variety of other kind of psychological strategies to the table when they were talking about inequality. And it's quite important to kind of understand these. It's not just rational judgments you're dealing with. And one of these strategies was something that psychologists call cognitive coping. So to cut a long story short, it's not nice to think about inequality. It's not nice to think you might live in an unfair world. And a consequence of that is, rather than trying to confront that and ask if stuff is fair, it's much easier for people to make up stuff that makes it fair that the world is how it is. Let me give you an example. We gave people some fictional characters in particular positions. And what we found very, very quickly, without telling them anything about them, is they'd make up stuff about them that would make it fair that they were where they were. So a consequence of this, for example, is that if someone's on a high income, people will tend to invent or inflate their virtues to make it fair that they should be getting a high income. Perhaps more seriously, at the other end of the spectrum, people will tend to denigrate people in low-income groups, again, to make it fair that they are where they are. And this kind of coping strategy is very, very prevalent, and it's quite difficult to deal with. I'll come back to that in a moment, but how you get people out of justifying existing inequalities as fair is quite a difficult issue. Now, interestingly, even though we didn't plan it in this way, our research started before the credit crunch, or at least a kind of main crunch in September 2008, and continued on afterwards. So we kind of got a before and after effect. And what we found quite interestingly was that the credit crunch really shook these coping strategies. All of a sudden, this default tendency to justify existing inequalities as fair gave way pretty much overnight to real anger and all of a sudden a willingness to ask, particularly for inequality at the top, are these inequalities deserved? Which politically is quite significant. Don't really know how long that will last. It doesn't really seem that politicians, campaigners are capitalising on this window of opportunity, but people do still seem to be in a mode of questioning inequality more. Attitudes to high salaries. Let me just talk you through a couple of things quickly. So a flip side of a belief in deserved inequality is anger when you think salaries are excessive. Just to give you a couple of questions. We asked people, salaries of 150 grand deserved, net disagreement there. Salaries of 150 grand too much because they're not needed. Again, net agreement there. So people getting queasy around that level. Just some regional differences within the UK while we're here. Slightly different phrasing of a question. £100,000, people getting that overpaid. Quite strong agreement. People are quite comfy with the concept of overpaid. As you got further out of London, people not only seem to get angry about the credit crunch, which is very much seems a city phenomenon, but maybe reflecting regional differences in pay, tended to be more critical of excessively high salaries than they were in London and the southeast. Okay, I'm not really going to look at many graphs here. Let me just quickly explain this one. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation wanted us to look at the things that drive public attitudes. You know, when you look at a poll normally, it'll tell you what people think, but actually what's more interesting to know is why they're thinking that, particularly if you might do something new and want to know how they'll respond to that. This graph shows factors driving support for, well, the bar's going up as support for, or if they're going down, opposition to, policies to tackle inequality at the top. The blue bars, generic proposal to increase tax at the top, the red ones to reduce the gap in incomes. As you can see, if you subscribe to that need-based norm, particularly those egalitarians, that very strongly drives support for increasing tax at the top and so on and so forth. If you think high salaries are deserved, that reduces support, so on and so forth. Just let me quickly draw your attention to the bar on your right here. Inequality is inevitable. So quite a strong belief a lot of people have, or if less a belief, people are quite fatalistic about inequality. They're not really sure we can do anything about it. We asked people in a poll, there's nothing you can do about inequality in a market economy. Agree, disagree. And 51% of people agreed with that. And this fatalism, a bit like the cognitive coping you've just seen, this fatalism is used by people to close down issues of fairness and whatever, you know, we can't do anything about it. If I had £1 for every time I'd heard someone say, it's just the way it is, when I tried to ask them about fairness in a focus group, I'd be quite rich. As you can see, this belief that inequality is inevitable reduces support quite strongly for potentially egalitarian measures. So thinking about, we did a lot of work with campaigners. A really important underlying belief for campaigners to address is that we can, in fact, do something about this. It's very, very important. Now, I've been talking up till now about intrinsic fairness. Harry also mentioned instrumental reasons for being worried about inequality, and in particular its effect on societies. And the work that Harry mentioned by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in their book The Spirit Level that came out at Easter, which is really looking at the consequences of income inequality on societies. We were very lucky to be able to use some of their research to do these focus groups in 2008. And here's an example. So this graph is looking at child conflict in relation to income inequality. The graph is grossly simplified because we were using a stimulus material and people don't like looking at graphs. But you could basically see less equal countries have more child conflict, with the UK way up at the top. More equal countries have less child conflict. Causally, what's going on here, according to Richard and Kate, income inequality sets up a hierarchy of status. That causes status tensions. From a very early age, children can make status differentiation, so in terms of cars, clothes, so on and so forth. That leads to child conflict here. That means name-calling, bullying, fighting, and so on and so forth. Now, people were very, very moved when we showed them this kind of evidence. They found it intuitively plausible, and even those people who weren't really that moved about intrinsic fairness and inequality, perhaps people who are more on the right of the political spectrum or more on the libertarian end of the political spectrum, even if they weren't so much concerned about individual fairness, they thought the effects of inequality on society were really quite important and would be an important reason for tackling inequality. I've given you this example because child conflict, that was the thing that really moved our participants the most. But some of the other issues Harry mentioned, crime, lack of trust, mental health problems, and so on and so forth, they were all found plausible too. Let me mention a couple of other things quickly, because I know time is ticking on. So, I mean, we're in quite a bad place with welfare policy in the UK at the moment. Here's a trend over the last 20 or so years. The proportion of people agreeing that we should increase benefits for the poor is how the question is worded, even if it leads to higher taxes, and as you can see, it's on a declining trend. What you find out pretty quickly is it's not because people don't like progressive tax or progressive benefits, which take more from those who have more and give more to those who have less. In principle, they're absolutely fine with that. Why you have that kind of opposition is really because of quite negative and punitive views towards those in poverty in the UK and those receiving benefits. I just want to finish by looking at where some of these negative attitudes come from. We did an experiment, because something you notice very quickly, if you talk about inequality, is there's a real asymmetry between how people think about the top and the bottom. And just really to endorse what Kate was saying earlier, everyone places themselves in the middle. Just psychologically, it's very, very important. I don't know if anyone saw, in summer 2008, the commentator Polly Toynbee did some focus groups with investment banks like Goldman Sachs. She was allowed to go in and talk with some of their staff. So we talk about the uber rich here. And they all wanted to think of themselves as average as well. They placed themselves in the middle, and they kind of invented someone even richer than them to get angry about. And it's just a very, very common psychological strategy. From this perspective of being in the middle, what we found very quickly is that people look at those at the top and the bottom in very different ways. And we wanted to explore some of these asymmetries. Basically, attitudes towards those on low incomes, those in receipt of benefits, are often more negative. And we tried an experiment to look at this. We gave people examples of two individuals who were kind of free riding at the top and the bottom. One was engaged in tax avoidance. The other was doing something dodgy with the benefit system, claiming without trying to get a job. And what came through was a variety of these asymmetries. So first of all, a much greater tendency to ascribe individual blame to people at the bottom. You know, even though people were very angry about tax avoidance, they were like, oh, it's the government's fault for having loopholes. But they were quite clear it wasn't the government's fault for having loopholes in the benefit system. It was the individual's fault. Well, the cognitive coping I've already mentioned. People exaggerate desert at the top and understate it at the bottom to make it fair that people are unequal. And this one's a really, really important one. people seem to be able to draw on both positive and negative stereotypes of the rich. There's kind of like Alan Sugar or J.K. Rowling, good rich, and a kind of Fred Goodwin, evil rich. At the bottom, however, people could only seem to draw on negative stereotypes. People didn't have a category in their mind, a positive image of a struggling low-income family. We've been very blighted in the UK. Even countries like the US and Australia, quite neoliberal countries, a bit like us, because of their national histories, they have developed positive images of struggling low-income families because of their revolutionary or countercultural histories. In the UK, we haven't, and it's just a big problem. People can't seem to draw on a positive stereotype of someone in poverty. Let me just finish with a final couple of slides. So again, we wanted to look at the drivers of these negative views, and we found two really important drivers. One was a widespread belief that basically, even though opportunities aren't equal, there's enough opportunity for everyone to get on if they really want to. And the consequence of that is you'll tend to blame the individual for being where they are, for why they are where they are. So we asked people to agree or disagree with this. There's enough opportunity for virtually everyone to get on if they really want to. It comes down to the individual. Huge net agreement with that. Some people are severely disadvantaged and find it impossible, however hard they work, to overcome the barriers they face. Net disagreement with that. This belief in the ready availability of opportunity leads people to blame individuals themselves for being where they are. The second key driver is a really widespread belief that people receiving benefits now wouldn't go on to make a contribution back to society in future. So we asked people, agree, disagree. Most people who receive benefits now will make a contribution back in future through work, caring, etc. Net disagreement with that. This is I said we weren't going to look at any other graphs. This is a graph of the bar on the right hand side is that big reduction in support. So these are factors that reduce support for increasing benefits for the poor. That question we looked at earlier. And as you can see, that belief that people wouldn't go on to make a contribution back massively reduces support. There is something actually a bit optimistic about this graph. The bar over on your left, higher income group, that's like a proxy for self-interest. And what we're showing here, sorry, these bars, by the way, sorry, they're regression coefficients. So they're demonstrating the strength of association between an underlying belief and opposition to redistribution. And what you can see is actually self-interest. Yes, it does reduce support for redistribution a little bit, but that's not a particularly important factor. Beliefs and values tend to matter more. The middle bar is a view that it's the poor's fault for being where they are. They've only got themselves to blame. But that's not nearly as powerful, that kind of backward-looking view of why people where they are where they are, as a belief that people will go on and contribute in future. So there's a little bit of optimism there, because we can actually do something about the perception of what people claiming benefits will go on to do in future. Sadly, often the government narrates its policy about welfare with a very negative story which undermines confidence in what people will do. So the irony is benefit fraud has fallen a lot over the last decade, but people are getting more and more anxious about benefit fraud. And the reason is because the government tells them it's reduced benefit fraud because it's cracked down on people cheating. Now, if people are worried about the intentions of people claiming welfare, that makes them more anxious. You know, what the government should be saying is benefit fraud's low because people are basically honest and the system's intact. I've gone on for a while there, so I'm going to stop there. Just let me wrap up with a very final set of remarks, just about engaging the public. So, need to understand people's different starting points and motivations. There are different groups within the population. I wish everybody thought the same as I do, but they don't. And you know, this kind of overarching appeals for greater equality in and of themselves won't necessarily have much traction with them. And need to get past barriers to deeper engagement. Lack of information, I haven't particularly talked about that there, but there's a lot of ignorance out there about things like inequality tax benefits. A reliance on stereotypes that may be inaccurate. Huge numbers of people enter discussions about welfare and equality at the level of stereotypes. Why we gave them some of these fictional characters you've seen these clip art pictures of is precisely to get them out of stereotypes, to talk about concrete situations. But if people are relying on negative stereotypes, that's a real challenge. Combating that fatalism I talked about, that inequality is inevitable. Connecting with people's everyday concerns, but an opportunity to inspire. That Richard Wilkinson evidence, where we were showing people the effect of income inequality on society, one thing that came out of those exercises is people could see that in other countries they were less unequal than us. And that was actually quite important for tackling that fatalism. Actually, people thought, hang on, it can be different somewhere else. So actually, even though we were looking at that Richard Wilkinson stuff for a different reason, by seeing that other countries were doing it better than us, that did actually give people some confidence. And what you were talking about, Kate, that they're not going to be prepared to pay tax if they don't think we can do anything about it. It made them think, oh, well, actually, maybe government can make a difference. So think about ways to inspire people and give them confidence, and that is really important.
Thank you very much, Tim.